This is the frickin' real deal.
We want to know how to use information to our frickin' advantage.
So in this video we're going to explore a few dichotomies because they're going to help us inform our worldviews and ultimately, hopefully, inform us as to how to live better lives. But let me just quickly use what might at first seem to be trivial example of how knowledge or information can help inform us to live better lives. So I think if you ask any lad's lad, any man's man, any dude what the best form of martial arts is, he will predictably and almost inevitably use as a benchmark against which to judge the various different forms of martial arts effectiveness. He's going to use the benchmark of a street fight and he's going to say, hey, look, for example, jiu-jitsu is shocking bad because in a street fight you find yourself on the tarmac. You don't want to be rolling around on tarmac. It's going to hurt big time. It's going to hurt the old joints big time. You're going to get scratched up big time. So therefore boxing is the best. But then somebody else is going to come along and say, yeah, but in boxing there's quite a formal technique in terms of stance and position in general that can be exploited by a person who knows how to kick. So that is going to be a nice little, what might at first seem to be trivial example to which we will continue to refer in this video. So let's consider the first dichotomy. This is the dichotomy between the philosophical and the practical. Philosophical information or knowledge and practical information or knowledge. Let's separate those into two categories. Boom, boom. Some might say that philosophical knowledge is useless because it's mere abstraction and concepts that you just toy around with in your head and debate and discuss with other people, and there's no real world effect of said knowledge. That's not what I'm saying. I actually think philosophical study is extremely important for an individual, especially in today's chaotic day and age. Because for one thing, a philosophical study can help you inform your values. What do you value? And if you don't explicitly ask yourself that question or pose to yourself that question, then your values are just going to be given to you by your culture, which is itself decadent and sick. So you're going to adopt decadent and sick values, which will lead to you becoming decadent and sick. Do you want that? I don't. So that's one useful aspect of studying philosophy. That being said, there's a difference between that and practical application. Practical knowledge, actual know-how of particulars in the world, particular systems, how to tinker properly or appropriately with particular systems in the world, is different to philosophizing. But, and here's where I want to make a case, you can study philosophy and have it as a foundation from which you can go into the world and practically tinker. That is where I think philosophy has value. Okay, second dichotomy, which I think is related and overlaps somewhat. This is the difference between ludic domains and ecological domains of knowledge. So in ludic domains, ludic is a Greek word, there's the definition. You're supplied in advance explicitly with the rules, and you know you have to play within those rules. So it's a game you're playing, and there's a clear definition of success, a clear definition of failure. Boom, there you go. Play that game. Succeed if you will, fail if you don't want to play. So the classroom is a good example of this, where you get good grades if you play the game well, and you get bad grades if you play the game poorly. But the ecological domain is completely different. And the ecological domain is the real world. In the ecological domain, the rules aren't obvious. They're not defined, or at least not well defined. And you can't isolate variables in the same way that you can in the ludic domain, where what is being studied or the game being played has clearly defined rules. This is so interesting because most of what's considered to be education, formal, institutionalized education, comes from that ludic domain, the classroom, the lecture hall, the lecture theatre, whatever. And then once a person graduates, they're expected to be able to play well in the real world, in the ecological domain. There is no clear evidence that shows you can easily translate how to play well in the ludic domain to how to play well in the ecological domain. And in fact, the inverse is true. Those who are good in the ludic domain are shockingly bad in the ecological domain. The theories that are in retrospect applied to the innovation or discovery and then taught in the ludic domain are retrospectively imposed on the history that leads up to that innovation or discovery. Where we make an error is in thinking that the theory, knowing the theory, logically leads to the innovation or discovery. That's not the case. What instead happens is there is a person or people who rationally interact with and tinker with the real world in the ecological domain and find certain insights that then inform the innovation or discovery. But they could never have theoretically find themselves making that discovery or innovation by just studying pure theory. They needed to interact with the real world and see how the complexity of the real world can be tinkered with, played with, and used to their advantage. A rational flaneur. And a flaneur is somebody who is just aimlessly going about his or her life, but, and here's the crucial point, rationally deciding a course of action amidst the uncertainty of life and making their way through life this way. What a contrast between the rational flaneur and the graduate student who thinks that the world is well defined scientifically, and that the picture is more or less complete and we just have to work within that picture. That's not the case. And I actually think that there is, in this day and age, in the particular place in history where we are, there's a necessity for more rational flaneurs because of how chaotic the world has become. And I think that this chaos stems in no small part from the likes of graduate students thinking that they can impose their particular vision of the world onto the world and make an awful lot of mistakes in the process. For example, there is Iatrogenics in medicine, where you get hyper-specialized chemists or whatever, biochemists, who see a pathway that is malfunctioning. And they say, oh, this single chemical molecule will address that problem, which in all fairness, it does. However, another first order effect of the application of that new novel chemical medicine is the emergence of many other problems that were unintended consequences of the application of that medicine. So in blinkering themselves and seeing the world through a very narrow lens, they may fix the problem, the defined problem, but create 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 more that they then think completely irrationally that they can fix using the same method. Thirdly, this is so fascinating, I love this stuff. But the third dichotomy is the difference between the the complicated and the complex. So the complicated system is a system that has many moving parts, but can, in theory at least, be fully understood by an individual, where you actually can control for all the variables and test a single variable, where you can isolate a single variable and see its effects. But then you get the complex, and the complex is a different ballgame. You can't apply the same rules that you and principles that you use in the complicated system to troubleshoot and tinker as you do in the complex. It's a completely different ballgame, and Bret speaks to this in episode 223 of the Darkhorse podcast.
We are often in the situation where our toolkit isn't up to the challenge, and the place where this is most important is this transition from complicated to complex, right? We have inferred the rules, the philosophical rules of science and how it is to be done from the stuff that we've succeeded at first, all of which is over on the simple end of the continuum. As you get into complexity space, the rules change, and we do not have a vibrant culture that is learning from our mistakes and saying, actually, here's the problem. You've got Popperian falsification, but if you try to wield that over in biology space, you'll prove that everything is false, because you'll find an exception to everything, because the sheer complexity of all of these things means that there will be things that deviate. It's not a physics lab, right? It's not a chemistry bench. It behaves in a different way. So those falsifications aren't falsifications. They're indications of the number of processes that influence the thing that you're studying. And so you have to think about it differently.
So from the complex, it's not that it's completely incomprehensible. Then it's a lost cause. Then we're going to lose as humans on this earth. But it is to say that we can't apply the same tools or toolkit that we use in complicated systems to the complex system. But we can, using a different toolkit, wrestle from the complex system, signal enough to be able to show other people and say, here, look, this seems to be the case. I'm fairly confident that this is why this is happening, that this X is why Z is happening. But it's a completely different mindset going into it that you need to adopt to understand and, if you so desire, affect the complex system. But really the upshot of all of this is we need in the world today more rational flaneur types, more people who can follow innate impulses and take what's valuable and shed the rest. Rationally think, oh yes, that seems to have a massive upside, and should I find myself on the downside, it's a very small downside. So the potential for huge gains with the risk of only small losses. This is where the rational flaneur mindset comes into play. That's the upshot of all this. And really I think this is massively consequential, because it is the hyper-specialised expert class who are contributing massively to the many different ecological issues we face. And until we can catalyse the creation and emergence of a whole new class of people who can comprehend complexity, who can deal with complexity and uncertainty, then the hyper-specialised class will run us all into the ground. That's not to say the hyper-specialised class is completely useless. There's been many gains given to humanity by that class. But it is to say that let's not be fooled into thinking that that's the only way to gain valuable knowledge. It's not. Yeah, how can I forget? Let's return to the street fight analogy. So, that street fight is quite a disorderly setting. The variables cannot be controlled, that's for sure. Because you've got an angry opponent and you need to defend yourself and attack, or just run for defense. But you need to defend yourself. And he's quite the unpredictable human. You don't know, does he have technical knowledge about how to flatten me out? Does he have technical knowledge about how to just pop me and send me off into a different realm? You don't know. So it's those sorts of disorderly settings, those sorts of ecological situations that we need to build our experience in. We need to become more experienced in these sorts of situations and settings. That's not to say you need to find yourself in many more street fights. No, don't do that. Just join MMA. That way you You could get the upside of finding yourself in a street fight without the downside of hitting your head off the tarmac, for example. So you get the massive upside of learning how to behave and be in such a situation without the massive downside of losing your life, for the most part, you know. Of course, there are exceptional cases in MMA where people lose their lives, but they're the exceptions. And it's just a risk that you're going to have to take. Why do people fear taking risks so much? People are such cowards. There's such a lack of courage in that. It's revolting to me. So we need to push ourselves onto the world in this way and figure things out in this way.